Before we begin tonight, Richard, thank you for your kind donation on Buy Me a Coffee. It is genuinely, deeply appreciated, and we want you to know that it matters more than you probably realise, and knowing that someone out there listened, enjoyed it, and cared enough to support the work, that is what keeps this whole thing running. We are so glad you're enjoying the content, and I also want to thank Robert, because tonight's story exists because of him. Robert sent in this idea. If you are listening tonight, this is your episode. And if any of you out there have a story you think belongs here, a mystery you cannot stop thinking about, a theory that has been rattling around in the back of your mind at 2 a.m, send it in. This channel is built out of the things you bring to it. All right, get comfortable, turn the lights down, let your shoulders drop away from your ears, let the day you just had start to loosen its grip. Tonight, we are going to talk about a man who spent the last decade of his life screaming into the void that someone was going to kill him, and about what he may have left behind when they did. This is the Dead Hand Protocol. Ready? Then let us begin. There is a particular kind of person who becomes impossible for the world to categorise. Not a hero, not a villain, not a genius exactly, and not a fraud exactly. Something stranger. Something that does not fit into the shapes we have built to hold people. John McAfee was one of those people. You almost certainly know his name, even if you have never thought about him for more than a few seconds. It is a name that lived on the bottom corner of computer screens for 2 decades. A small icon in a system tray. A subscription your father forgot to cancel. A pop-up window that appeared at the worst possible moment and told you that your protection had expired. John McAfee. For an entire generation, that name meant nothing more than a slightly irritating piece of software. But the man behind the name was something else entirely. He was born in 1945 on a military base in Gloucestershire, England, to an American father and a British mother. His father was a soldier and later a road surveyor, and by many accounts a violent alcoholic. The family moved to Virginia when McAfee was still a child, and when McAfee was 15 years old, his father took his own life in the family home. McAfee spoke about it rarely, and when he did, he spoke about it as something that had permanently rearranged him. He said that every day of his life he woke up with his father inside him. He said that he could feel him there, in the anger, in the restlessness, in the constant need to move. Hold that detail for a moment, because a great deal of what happens later only makes sense if you understand that John McAfee was a man who had learned, very young, that the people closest to you can vanish without warning, and that the world does not stop when they do. He studied mathematics. He worked in the 1960s and 70s at some of the most serious institutions in American technology and industry. He wrote code for punch card systems. He worked on voice recognition. He worked at Lockheed. He worked at Xerox. He worked, at one point, on classified projects, though the details of what exactly he did there have always been vague, and McAfee himself gave different answers at different times, depending on who was asking and what mood he was in. He also drank, heavily. He took drugs, extensively, and he was open about it in a way that most men of his position never were. He was, by his own account, functionally unemployable at several points in his early career, and he was fired more than once for behaviour he later described without apology. And then, in 1986, something happened that changed the trajectory of his entire life. A piece of software appeared in Pakistan. It was called Brain. It was, depending on how you count these things, one of the first computer viruses ever released into the wild on personal computers. It was not especially destructive. It was almost polite by modern standards. It replaced the boot sector of a floppy disk and displayed a message with the names and address of the 2 brothers who wrote it. But McAfee saw it, and he understood something immediately that almost nobody else understood yet. He understood that this was going to be an industry, not a nuisance, not a curiosity, an industry. Because the moment computers became connected, the moment information began flowing between machines, there would be things that travelled in that flow which people did not want, and someone would need to sell the world a way to feel safe. He He founded McAfee Associates out of his home in Santa Clara. He gave the antivirus software away for free, which almost nobody did at the time, and then charged corporations for licenses. It was an extraordinarily clever business model, and it worked. Within a few years, McAfee Associates was one of the fastest growing software companies in America. He took it public in 1992, and here is the part of the story that people forget. John McAfee, the man whose name became synonymous with computer security, walked away from the company almost immediately. He sold his stake. He left. By the mid-1990s, he was gone entirely, and he was worth, at his peak, something in the neighbourhood of $100 million. He was not yet 50 years old, and he had already made and left a fortune. What do you do with the rest of your life after that? If you are John McAfee, you do everything. All of it. At once. He bought property in Colorado, in Hawaii, in Texas, and New Mexico. He got into yoga, seriously enough to write books about it. He got into aerotrekking, flying tiny ultralight aircraft low over the desert, and he built an airfield for it in New Mexico and gathered a small community of pilots around him. And then, in 2008, the financial crisis arrived, and McAfee's fortune, which had been heavily exposed to real estate and to the market, collapsed. Not entirely, but dramatically. He later claimed he was down to around $4 million, which is an amount of money that sounds enormous to almost everyone listening to this, and which, to a man who had once had 100 million, felt like ruin. Around the same time, a nephew of one of his aerotrekking students was killed in a crash. A lawsuit followed. McAfee sold his properties. He liquidated. He auctioned off his life at a fraction of its value, and then he left the United States. He went to Belize. Part 2. The Compound. Picture the coast of Belize. Warm, humid air that never quite lets go of you. The sound of water moving against wooden pilings, palm fronds rattling in a breeze that comes off the Caribbean in the late afternoon. Insects, constantly. A wall of sound that you stop hearing after the first week and never stop hearing again after that. Belize is a small country, fewer than 400,000 people, English-speaking, which matters because it makes it a comfortable place for a certain kind of American expatriate to disappear into. There is money there, and there is the movement of money there, and there are places where the two do not want to be examined too closely. McAfee arrived in 2008, and he bought property. Several properties, eventually. One on the mainland, in a place called Orange Walk, one on Ambergris Caye, the island off the coast where the tourists go. And what he built there was not a retirement. It was something closer to a court. He surrounded himself with people, young women, several of them, in arrangements that were complicated and that he never bothered to explain or defend. Armed guards, a rotating cast of local men with weapons who patrolled the perimeter of his compound. Dogs, 11 of them at one point that he kept and that barked at anything that moved along the beach. And programmers. This is the detail that matters most for our story tonight, because McAfee, in Belize, was not idle. He set up a laboratory. He hired a team, and officially, publicly, on the record, what he said he was doing was pharmaceutical research. He was looking, he claimed, for a new class of antibiotic. He talked about compounds derived from local plants. He talked about quorum sensing, the mechanism by which bacteria communicate with each other and coordinate their behaviour, and about the possibility of disrupting that communication rather than killing the bacteria outright. It is, for what it is worth, a real and legitimate area of research, and the fact that McAfee was talking about it is one of the many things about him that made him so difficult to dismiss. He was never simply raving. There was always a thread of something real running underneath, but the Belizean authorities became interested in what was happening on that compound. In April of 2012, the gang suppression unit raided the property. They arrested him. They held him briefly. They alleged that he was manufacturing methamphetamine and that he was in possession of unlicensed weapons. The charges did not stick. He was released. Nothing was proven. McAfee's version of events was that this was harassment, that a government official had asked him for a donation, or a bribe, depending on which telling you heard, and that when he refused, the state came for him. He said this loudly and repeatedly, and to anyone who would listen. And here is where, in our story tonight, the first thread of the conspiracy begins to show itself. Because according to the theory, the pharmaceutical laboratory was real. The antibiotic research was real. McAfee was not lying about any of it. He was simply not telling anyone about the other thing in the building. According to the conspiracy, in the back rooms of that compound behind the laboratory, McAfee had assembled something else. Servers, a great many of them, cooled badly, running hot, humming 24 hours a day in a country where the power grid was unreliable and where McAfee had installed generators that could carry the load through any outage. And what those servers were doing, according to the theory, was listening. Not to Belize, not to his neighbours, not to anything local. They were listening to the shape of the internet itself. Let me explain what that means, because it is not as strange as it sounds, and because the way it works is genuinely interesting, and because thinking about interesting things while lying still in the dark is one of the better ways to fall asleep. Every piece of information that moves across the internet moves in packets, small discrete parcels of data, each one wrapped in a header that describes where it came from, where it is going, how large it is, and what protocol it is using. The contents of a packet can be encrypted. Usually they are. But the header, by necessity, cannot be, because the routers along the way need to read it in order to know where to send it. This means that even when you cannot read what is being said, you can read who is speaking to whom, and how often, and how much, and when. Intelligence professionals have a name for this. They call it traffic analysis. And it is in many cases more valuable than the content itself, because content lies and patterns do not. A person can write anything in a message, but the fact that a person sent 40 messages to a particular address at 3 a.m. on the night before a particular event, that is very difficult to fake and very difficult to hide. McAfee, according to the conspiracy, had built a machine that watched patterns, not what people were saying, where the saying was going. And what he began to notice, over months of watching, was that certain flows of information did not behave the way they should. There were routes that appeared and disappeared. There were volumes of traffic moving between institutions that had no public reason to be speaking to each other at all. Financial clearinghouses talking to social media infrastructure. Telecommunications backbones talking to systems that resolved, when he traced them, to addresses registered to defence subcontractors in 3 different countries. None of it was illegal, as far as he could tell. Most of it was not even hidden exactly. It was simply not looked at because almost nobody had any reason to look at it, and because the people who did look at it professionally worked for the institutions doing the talking. McAfee started telling friends that governments were building something, not censorship. He was very specific about this, according to the people who knew him then. Censorship is what you do when you are afraid of information. What he believed was being built was the opposite. It was a system that wanted information, all of it, as much as could possibly be gathered. Because you do not need to silence a population if you can predict it. That was the phrase he used, over and over, in the years that followed. Predictive Control. Part 3. The Neighbour. On the morning of November 11th, 2012, a man named Gregory Fall was found dead in his home on Ambergris Cay. He was a builder from Florida, 62 years old, who had come to Belize for the same reasons a lot of Americans come to Belize. He had a house on the Cay beach. He had a life there. He was, by the accounts of the people who knew him, a fairly ordinary man living a fairly pleasant life in a beautiful place. He had been shot once in the back of the head. His laptop and phone were missing, and his house was a short walk from the compound of John McAfee. The 2 men had not been friendly. This is a matter of public record, and it was well known on the island. Fall had complained about McAfee's dogs, which barked constantly. He had complained about the armed guards. He had, some weeks before his death, filed a formal complaint with the local authorities about the noise and about what he considered the general menace of having that operation next door. And then, days before Fall was killed, several of McAfee's dogs were poisoned. McAfee never accused Fall of the poisoning directly, not in any formal way. But the tension on that stretch of beach was enormous, and everyone on the island knew it. So when the police came looking for John McAfee, it was not a mysterious or unreasonable thing for them to do. He was a neighbour. He was a neighbour with a documented dispute. Any competent police force anywhere in the world would have wanted to speak with him. They wanted to speak with him. That is the important detail. He was never charged. He was never named a suspect in any formal sense. The Belizean police described him, in the language they used at the time, as a person of interest. They wanted to ask him questions. John McAfee did not want to answer questions. Instead, he ran. What followed was one of the strangest fugitive stories of the modern era, and it played out in something close to real time on the internet, which had never quite happened before in this way. McAfee went into hiding, but he did not go quiet. He started a blog. He gave interviews by phone to reporters all over the world. He posted regularly, sometimes multiple times a day, describing his situation in increasingly baroque detail. He said he had buried himself in sand with a cardboard box over his head, while police searched his property, and that a lizard had wandered across his face while he lay there, and that he had not moved. He said he had disguised himself as a German tourist, as a salesman, as an elderly man with a limp. He said he had dyed his hair, stained his teeth, put a shoe insert in one boot to change his gait. Some of it was almost certainly true, some of it was almost certainly embellished. And the extraordinary thing about John McAfee, the thing that makes this whole story so difficult to hold in your hands, is that there is no reliable way to sort one from the other. He lied constantly, and he told the truth constantly, and he seemed to enjoy the fact that nobody could tell which was which. He fled through Belize, he crossed into Guatemala, and there, in Guatemala City, the entire performance collapsed in the most absurd way imaginable. He had brought 2 journalists from Vice magazine with him. They published a photograph of him, and the photograph, uploaded straight from an iPhone, still had its metadata attached, including the GPS coordinates of where it was taken. The internet found it within hours. The location was public before the day was out. McAfee's response was to claim that he had deliberately faked the metadata to mislead his pursuers. Nobody believed him. He was arrested by Guatemalan authorities for entering the country illegally. He faked a heart attack in custody to delay his deportation to Belize, and eventually Guatemala simply put him on a plane to Miami and washed their hands of the entire affair. The Fall murder was never solved. In 2019, a civil court in Florida found McAfee liable in a wrongful death suit brought by Fall's family and ordered him to pay $25 million. He never paid it. A civil finding is not a criminal conviction, and no criminal charges were ever brought against him by any authority in any country. So that is the public record. A murdered neighbour, an unsolved case, a fugitive who talked his way across a border and then talked his way onto a plane. And here is where our story diverges from it. Because according to the conspiracy, John McAfee did not run from Belize because he was afraid of being charged with murder. He ran because of what the police would find if they came onto his property with a warrant. The theory holds that when McAfee learned the authorities were coming, he had roughly 6 hours, and that he did not spend those 6 hours preparing an alibi or contacting a lawyer. He spent them cloning drives. Part 4. The Black Drives. Here is what the conspiracy claims happened in those 6 hours. McAfee had, by that point, accumulated something in the range of several terabytes of material. Traffic analysis logs, routing tables, correlation maps, documents obtained from sources he never named, notes, thousands of pages of them, in his own handwriting, photographed and digitized. He could not take it with him. A man running through the jungle cannot carry a server rack, so he broke it apart. The theory describes a specific technique, and the technique is real, which is part of what makes this story work as well as it does. It is called secret sharing. The mathematics behind it were published in 1979 by a cryptographer named Adi Shamir, and it is used today in serious security applications all over the world. The idea is beautiful in its simplicity. Imagine you have a secret, and you want to divide it among 5 people in such a way that no one person can recover it alone, and no 2 people working together can recover it, and no 3, but any 4 of them working together can reconstruct it perfectly. You can do this, not with a photocopier and a pair of scissors, but with mathematics. Think of a point on a graph. If I tell you a single point, you cannot tell me what line passes through it, because infinitely many lines pass through any single point. But if I tell you 2 points, there is exactly 1 straight line that connects them. If I want to require 3 points instead of 2, I use a curve instead of a line, a parabola, and so on, up and up, as many points as you like. So you take your secret and you encode it as the starting value of a curve. Then you pick points along that curve, 1 for each person you want to give a share to. Each person receives a point, not the secret. A point. 1 point tells you nothing. 2 points tell you nothing. But gather enough of them, and the curve snaps into focus, and the secret sitting at the beginning of it becomes readable. That, according to the conspiracy, is what McAfee did with his archive. He split it into fragments, each fragment individually useless, each one mathematically meaningless on its own, and then he handed them out. 6 drives, the theory says, though the number varies depending on which version you hear. Some accounts say 8, some say 11. They went to a programmer in Estonia, to a former military contractor in Thailand, to a woman in Mexico City who had once worked for him and whose name has never been established, to a lawyer in London, to an address in Bulgaria that was, when investigators eventually tried to trace it, a mail forwarding service that had closed in 2015. None of these people, according to the story, knew what they were holding. Each of them was told the same thing, that the drive contained cryptocurrency wallets, that it was McAfee's money, distributed for safekeeping while he was in legal trouble, that they should hold it, not open it, and wait. And here is the elegant part of the deception. Because that story was true. The drives did contain cryptocurrency wallets, real ones, with real balances, in some cases substantial ones. Anyone who opened a drive out of curiosity would find exactly what they had been told they would find, and would conclude that the eccentric millionaire had told them the truth, and would close the drive and put it back in a safe. The other material was underneath, in the free space, in the slack. Because a hard drive is not a filing cabinet. When you write a file to a drive, the operating system records where it lives in an index, and it marks that region as occupied. But the drive is full of regions that are not indexed. Space between files. Space at the end of allocated blocks that is too small to hold anything, and is simply left empty. Space that once held a deleted file, and has been marked as available but not actually overwritten. If you know what you're doing, you can hide an enormous amount of material in the parts of a drive that nobody looks at, and the drive will report itself as almost empty, and every ordinary tool will agree. That, according to the conspiracy, is what was on those drives. An archive split into mathematical fragments, buried in the negative space of 6 ordinary hard disks, scattered across 5 countries, held by people who believed they were guarding pocket change. And John McAfee ran into the jungle with a cardboard box over his head and told the world a story about a lizard. Part 5. JANUS. Now we have to go backwards, because to understand what McAfee believed he had found, we have to go back to a time before Belize, before the compound, before any of it. Back to the years when he was still just a wealthy man in America looking for something to do with himself. The conspiracy holds that in the years after he left his company, McAfee did consulting work. This part is not particularly disputed. He had a name and a reputation, and companies paid for both. He sat on advisory boards, he looked at security architectures. He was, for a period, a person that serious institutions brought into rooms to ask what he thought about things. And in one of those rooms, according to the story, he saw a name he was not supposed to see. JANUS, named presumably for the Roman god of doorways and transitions. The god with two faces, one looking forward and one looking back. The god of beginnings and endings, of gates and passages, of the moment when one thing becomes another. It is a very good name for what the conspiracy says the program was. According to the theory, Janus emerged in the 18 months following the 11th of September, 2001. You have to understand the atmosphere of that period to understand why a program like this would seem not only reasonable, but urgent to the people who authorised it. Something enormous had happened, and the overwhelming conclusion of every subsequent investigation was that the information required to prevent it had existed. It had simply existed in pieces, in different buildings, in different databases, held by different agencies who did not talk to each other, and in some cases actively disliked each other. The failure was not a failure of collection, it was a failure of assembly. And so, the response across the entire Western intelligence apparatus was to tear down the walls between the databases. This is not conspiracy. This is documented history, and it happened in public, and there were acts of legislation about it. The transformation of intelligence collection in the 2000s was one of the largest institutional changes of the modern era. Where the conspiracy departs from history is in what it says the goal became. Because according to the theory, JANUS was not a surveillance program. It was a modelling program. The distinction is the entire heart of this story, so let us sit with it for a moment. Surveillance asks a question about the past and the present. Where is this person? Who did they speak to? What did they say? It is fundamentally retrospective. It looks at what has already happened and tries to understand it. A model asks a question about the future. Given everything I know about this population, what will they do next? And a model does not need to be perfect to be extraordinarily powerful. It only needs to be better than chance, and it only needs to be applied at scale. The architects of JANUS, according to the conspiracy, understood something that took the rest of the world another 15 years to understand. They understood that human behaviour is far more predictable than human beings believe it is. Individually, we are noisy. Any one person might do anything on any given day. But populations are not noisy. Populations are startlingly regular. Aggregate enough people and the randomness cancels out, and what remains is something close to a physical law. You already know this is true, even if you have never thought about it in these terms. A city knows how much water it will use tomorrow. A power company knows what the load will be at 7 in the evening. An insurance company knows, to a genuinely uncomfortable degree of precision, how many people of a given age in a given region will die this year, without knowing a single one of their names. We accept all of this without alarm because it feels like arithmetic. The conspiracy says that Janus asked what happens if you apply that same arithmetic to everything. Part 6. The Equation. By the late 2000s, according to the theory, Janus was ingesting 6 primary categories of information. Browsing histories, every page requested, every search entered, every link followed. Phone metadata, not calls necessarily. Who called whom, from where, for how long, at what hour. Location records, the single most revealing category of all, because a phone in a pocket produces a continuous record of a life. Where you sleep, where you work, where you go on a Tuesday afternoon when you told someone you were somewhere else. Financial transactions, what you buy, where, how often, and what changes when your circumstances change. Private communications to whatever degree they could be obtained, and biometrics, faces primarily, gait increasingly, voice, 6 streams. And the conspiracy holds that the genius of Janus was not in any single one of them, it was in the fusion, because each stream alone is limited, but together they correct each other. Location data tells you a person went to a particular building. Financial data tells you they did not spend money there. Communications data tells you they told nobody they were going. Suddenly the fact of the visit means something entirely different than it did a moment ago. This is what intelligence analysts call multi-source correlation, and it is the difference between knowing facts and knowing a person. and the theory holds that somewhere around 2009 JANUS crossed a threshold. It stopped being a system that answered questions. It started being a system that volunteered answers to questions nobody had asked. McAfee, according to the story, found the residue of this in the traffic patterns he was watching from Belize. He was not reading JANUS. He never had access to it. What he was seeing was its shadow, the shape of the hole it made in the flow of the world's information. And he became convinced of one thing above all others, that the people running JANUS had stopped watching people and had started forecasting them, and that the difference between those two activities was the difference between a telescope and a rifle. Part 7. The Reinvention. He came back. Not to Belize, obviously, but back into public life, in a way that surprised almost everyone who had assumed he would fade out. Between 2013 and 2016, John McAfee did a great many things. He ran for President of the United States, twice, first under a party he founded himself, and then seeking the Libertarian nomination. He appeared on television constantly. He made a video in 2013 called How to Uninstall McAfee Antivirus, which is one of the strangest pieces of media any person has ever released about their own life's work, and which you should look up sometime when you're not trying to fall asleep, because it is genuinely difficult to describe and will not help you rest. And then, around 2017, he found cryptocurrency. Or rather, cryptocurrency found him, because he was exactly the kind of figure that world was looking for. Charismatic, technical, contemptuous of institutions, willing to say enormous things in public without hedging. He said things about Bitcoin that became legendary for their recklessness. He promoted individual coins to hundreds of thousands of followers, many of which collapsed, and he was later charged by American authorities for exactly that behaviour. He was, by any reasonable assessment of the public record, deeply involved in the promotional excesses of that period. Most observers looked at this and saw a man doing what he had always done, finding the new thing, attaching himself to it, extracting attention and money from it, and moving on. The conspiracy says he had a different purpose, because blockchain technology has a property that is genuinely, structurally different from almost every other system humans have built for storing information. It cannot be quietly edited. Let me explain this, because it is the mechanism at the centre of everything that comes next, and because it is one of those ideas that is far simpler than the vocabulary around it suggests. A blockchain is a ledger, a list of transactions, nothing more exotic than that. What makes it unusual is how the list protects itself. Each block of transactions is passed through a mathematical function that produces a fixed-length string of characters, a fingerprint of the contents. Change even a single character anywhere in the block, and the fingerprint changes completely and unpredictably. Now, here is the trick. Each new block includes the fingerprint of the block before it, which means block 2 contains a fingerprint of block 1, and block 3 contains a fingerprint of block 2, which contained a fingerprint of block 1, and so on, forward, forever. Every block is chained to every block that came before it, so if you wanted to go back and alter a transaction from 3 years ago, you would change that block's fingerprint, which would break the next block which references it, so you would have to recalculate that one, which would break the one after, and so on, all the way to the present, in a cascade that never stops. And you would have to do all of this faster than the thousands of independent computers around the world that are currently adding new blocks to the real chain, because the network accepts the longest valid chain, and yours would have to overtake theirs. The security does not come from a vault. It comes from the fact that the past is load-bearing, and there is a second property that matters here. Most blockchains allow small amounts of arbitrary data to be attached to a transaction. Not much, a few dozen bytes typically. It was included for practical reasons, references, notes, protocol messages, but it means you can write something into the permanent, distributed, unalterable, publicly visible record of the world's financial transactions, a few dozen bytes at a time. The conspiracy says that between 2017 and 2020, John McAfee wrote his archive into the blockchain. not the archive itself. There was far too much of it. But the map, the index, the recovery keys, thousands of transactions, small ones, move in trivial amounts between anonymous wallets, each one carrying a few dozen bytes of encrypted payload, scattered across at least 4 different chains, interspersed with tens of thousands of ordinary transactions that carried nothing at all as camouflage. And every one of those fragments, according to the theory, is still there tonight, sitting in the permanent record, visible to anyone, readable by no one, because the fragments are worthless without the key, and the key was not in the blockchain. The key was in John McAfee. Part 8. The Warnings. Between 2017 and 2020, McAfee posted publicly, constantly, and strangely. Some of it was ordinary provocation, some of it was cryptocurrency promotion, and some of it was something else. He said repeatedly that he had material. He said he had documents. He said that if anything happened to him, it would be released. He said in a post that became famous after his death that he was not suicidal. That if he was found to have hanged himself, it would not have been by his own hand. He said he had tattooed a phrase on his arm for exactly this purpose, a phrase intended to be read as a message from beyond the fact of his death, so that no one could claim he had gone willingly. This is all documented. He said these things in public, and they are still there. Most people read them as theatre. He was a man who had built an entire second career on saying outrageous things, and the claim that shadowy forces wanted him dead was, frankly, on brand. But the conspiracy asks you to notice something about the timing. The warnings did not begin when his legal troubles began. They began before, and they became specific in a way that publicity stunts usually do not. He referenced time frames, he referenced numbers, he mentioned more than once a period of 72 hours in contexts that made no sense to anyone reading them. To the public it was noise from a man who generated a great deal of noise. To a small number of people who were paying a different kind of attention, according to the theory, it was a countdown, and it was being read out loud in public and nobody could hear it. Part 9. The Dead Hand. The phrase comes from somewhere real, and the real thing is worth understanding because it is one of the most unsettling pieces of engineering the 20th century produced. During the Cold War, the Soviet Union faced a strategic problem. If an attack destroyed their leadership before a retaliatory order could be given, deterrence would fail. And an enemy who believed they could achieve that might be tempted to try. The solution, developed in the 1980s, was a system called perimeter. In the West, it acquired a nickname, the Dead Hand. The concept was that if certain conditions were detected, seismic activity consistent with nuclear detonations, radiation spikes, and critically, a loss of communication with central command, then authority to launch would devolve automatically to a small crew in a hardened bunker, or in some accounts to the system itself. A machine that retaliates for a country that no longer exists. The logic is grim, and it is coherent. It removes the incentive to strike first by removing the possibility of a strike that succeeds. The conspiracy borrows the name deliberately, because the principle McAfee allegedly built on is the same. His system, according to the theory, worked like this. Every 72 hours a signal had to be sent, not a complicated one, a single authenticated transaction, from a wallet only he controlled, with a payload only he could generate. As long as the signal arrived, nothing happened. If the signal failed to arrive, a distributed network of small programs, sitting on rented servers in a dozen jurisdictions, would begin executing. Not all at once. That is the detail the theory insists on. A single simultaneous dump could be identified, indexed, and buried by the sheer volume of noise the internet produces. It would trend for a day and vanish. Instead, the release was designed to be slow. Keys published in sequence over weeks, each one meaningless alone, each one requiring the previous ones to be useful. A drip, not a flood. designed so that by the time anyone in a position to stop it understood what was happening, the first half would already be public and permanent and impossible to recall. That is the Dead Hand Protocol. And the reason the story is so difficult to shake is that building it would not have been especially hard. Every component described is ordinary. Scheduled tasks, distributed hosting, threshold cryptography, blockchain data fields. Any competent engineer could assemble it in a few months, which means the only question that matters is not whether it could exist. It is whether he built it. Part 10. Barcelona. On the 3rd of October, 2020, John McAfee was arrested at Barcelona El Prat airport. He was attempting to board a flight to Istanbul. He was carrying a firearm, according to Spanish authorities, which was itself an offence, but the arrest was made on an American warrant. The charges were tax evasion. The American indictment alleged that McAfee had failed to file returns for several years, despite earning income from consulting, speaking engagements, cryptocurrency promotions, and the sale of the rights to his own life story. A second indictment, unsealed later, concerned the cryptocurrency promotions themselves and alleged fraud. He was held in a prison outside Barcelona called Brian's 2. He would remain there for 8 months, and during those 8 months John McAfee did what he had always done. He talked, he gave interviews from prison, he posted on social media through intermediaries. He said, in an interview that has been widely quoted since, that he had accumulated material on corruption in multiple governments, and that it was held safely and would be released if he needed it. He said, again, in public, in his own words, that he was not going to kill himself. He described his conditions. He described the food. He described the other prisoners with what sounded genuinely like affection. He said he had made friends. He also said repeatedly that the tax charges were pretextual, that no one goes to this much trouble over unfiled returns, that the American government wanted him in a cell in America for reasons that had nothing to do with the Internal Revenue Service. The conspiracy takes him at his word. According to the theory, the arrest in Barcelona was not opportunistic. He had been in Spain for months. He had been visible. He had been photographed in public. He was not hiding, and no serious effort was made to detain him until the moment he attempted to leave for Turkey. Turkey, the theory notes, does not have an extradition arrangement with the United States that anyone would describe as reliable. The window was closing, and someone closed it. Part 11. The Visitors. Here the story leaves the record entirely, and you should hold what follows as fiction, because that is what it is. According to the conspiracy, in the final weeks before the extradition ruling, McAfee received visitors whose names do not appear in the prison log. Not many. 3 in most tellings. They came separately. They did not identify themselves as lawyers, and they did not appear on the consular schedule, and they did not come during general visiting hours. And after each visit, according to the story, something in him changed. The other prisoners noticed it first. He stopped talking as much. He stopped holding court in the yard. He began spending long periods alone with a notebook, writing what one inmate later described as columns of numbers and symbols that did not resemble words in any language. He asked twice for the notebook to be sealed and held for him. It was not, according to the theory, among his effects when he died. The most common version of the theory holds that the visitors were not there to threaten him. They were there to negotiate, that someone had worked out what the Dead Hand Protocol was and had understood that killing him would trigger it, and had come to find out what it would cost to make it stop, and that John McAfee, in a Spanish prison cell, at 75 years old, facing the end of his life either way, told them no, not out of heroism. The theory is careful about this, and it is one of the reasons the story is more interesting than it first appears. He told them no because the protocol was the only thing keeping him alive, and he knew it, and the moment he handed over the keys there was no reason for anyone anywhere to let him see another morning. Part 12. The Last Call. On the 22nd of June, 2021, the Spanish National Court approved John McAfee's extradition to the United States. According to the conspiracy, on the night before that ruling, McAfee made a call, not on a monitored prison line, on a device that should not have existed inside that facility, and which the theory says was brought in by one of the unlogged visitors, either carelessly or deliberately. The call lasted 12 minutes. There is no recording. There is no record of the number. There is, in the story, only the claim from a single anonymous source that it happened at all. And whoever was on the other end of that call, according to the theory, received the last instruction John McAfee ever gave. Part 13. The L. He was found dead in his cell on the 23rd of June, 2021, hours after the extradition ruling was announced. Spanish authorities said he had taken his own life. An autopsy was conducted. The Catalan Justice Department stated that the findings were consistent with suicide by hanging and that there were no signs of violence. The investigating court later closed the case. His wife, JANUS, publicly disputed the ruling and said she did not believe he had killed himself. She said his final message to her had been about love and about being together, not about ending anything. She campaigned for the body to be released and for an independent examination, and there were long delays. Those are the facts of what was said and by whom. And into the space between those facts the world poured everything it had. Because here is the problem, and it is a real problem, and not merely a conspiratorial one. John McAfee had spent years telling the entire world, on the record, publicly, at volume, that he would be killed, and that it would be made to look like suicide. And then he died, in custody, in a manner ruled suicide, hours after the last legal barrier between him and an American courtroom fell away. He had, in effect, written the caption on his own death years before it happened. Now. There is an entirely rational reading of this. A man who says for years that he will never take his own life may be a man arguing with himself. Public certainty is very often a defence against private doubt. And a 75-year-old facing decades in prison, separated from his wife, out of money, out of options, having spent his entire life in motion, and now confined to a small room, is a man in genuine danger from himself. That reading is not cynical. It is compassionate. It may well be correct. But you can see why it did not settle anything. Because the alternative reading requires nothing supernatural. It requires only that somebody, somewhere, found it convenient. And the thing about a man who has publicly predicted his own murder is that killing him becomes, paradoxically, safer. Everyone will assume the conspiracy. And the assumption of conspiracy is itself a kind of noise, and noise is cover. Part 14. The Activation. In the days after his death, strange things appeared on the internet. Some of this is documented. His social media accounts posted a single black image containing a stylized letter Q, which set off an enormous wave of speculation. The account was later said to be controlled by others. There were websites, there were countdowns, there were claims of encrypted archives with names attached to them, and there had been for years, some of them predating his death by a considerable margin. Almost all of it was noise. This is what happens now when anyone famous dies under ambiguous circumstances. An ecosystem exists that produces this material automatically, and it produces a great deal of it very quickly. But the conspiracy says that within the noise there was signal, specifically that in the first 72 hours before the imitators arrived, a small number of things appeared that were not like the others. Fragments of source code posted without explanation, that several security researchers examined and found to be internally consistent and non-trivial. Not the kind of thing a hoaxer generates. Real code doing something specific, in a style that suggested a single author. Coordinates, sets of numbers that resolved to physical locations, data centers mostly in Northern Virginia, in Frankfurt, in Singapore. Ordinary infrastructure publicly known, but a peculiar set to assemble. and a word appearing repeatedly in file names and in comments, and in one case in a variable declaration. JANUS. Part 15. The Journalist. Her name, in the story, is Olivia Mercer. She is not a real person. This part of our story is entirely invented, and I want to say that clearly. She's a journalist who covers financial crime, working freelance after her publication cut its investigative desk, which is a thing that has happened to a great many good reporters in the last 15 years. She hears about the McAfee fragments in the way that most people hear about most things now, which is that someone she vaguely knows sends her a link with 3 question marks and no context. She looks at it because she is procrastinating on something else, and the thing that catches her is not the drama. It is a detail so small that she almost scrolls past it. One of the code fragments contains a comment, a note left by a programmer to himself, of the kind every programmer leaves in every codebase in the world. The comment references a data format that Mercer recognizes because she spent 2 years covering a settlement involving a payment processor, and she read a great many technical exhibits during that period, and this format was in them. It is not a public format. It is proprietary. It is used by a specific class of financial clearing infrastructure and essentially nowhere else, and there is no earthly reason for it to appear in a joke posted by a stranger about a dead antivirus salesman, so she starts pulling. What she finds over the following months is not a smoking gun. She never finds a document that says here is the conspiracy, signed by the conspirators. What she finds is something much more mundane and much more disturbing. She finds relationships. A defense contractor that acquired a small analytics firm in 2011 for an amount of money wildly disproportionate to its revenue. The analytics firm's founders, who joined the parent company and then, 2 years later, left to found something else, which was in turn acquired by a company that provides content ranking infrastructure to social platforms. A telecommunications executive who took a position on the board of a payments company, and whose predecessor in that role had come from a national intelligence service, and whose successor went to one. Research grants, awarded through a foundation, to university departments studying crowd behaviour and information propagation, where the foundation's funding traced back through 2 intermediaries to a sovereign wealth fund. None of it illegal, none of it even secret particularly. All of it publicly filed, in documents nobody reads, in jurisdictions nobody checks, and all of it, when she maps it, forms a shape, not a pyramid, not a hierarchy with someone at the top, a mesh. Part 16. The Programmer. She finds him in the least dramatic way possible, which is that he answers an email. Darius Vale. Also fictional, a software engineer in his 50s who worked with McAfee twice, briefly, and who lives now in a converted farmhouse in a country he asks her not to name, and who has not held formal employment in 9 years. He agrees to meet her because he says he has been waiting for someone to ask the right question, and hers was close enough. What Vale tells her, over 3 days, is this. The archive was never a document. People keep looking for a document and there is no document. There is no folder marked the truth. What McAfee built was an index. The material JANUS produced was never centralized, because it did not need to be. That was the whole architecture. Each institution held its own data, in its own systems, under its own legal authority, entirely legitimately. What connected them was not a shared database. It was a shared protocol, a common language, a set of agreed formats, a way of asking each other questions that returned answers without either side transferring records. Nobody was hoarding. Everybody was querying. Which is why it never leaked in any conventional way. There was nothing to leak. You cannot photocopy a protocol. What McAfee assembled was not the data. It was the proof that the protocol existed and the map of who spoke it. And Vale explains why that is worse. Because a stolen database is a crime with a perpetrator. Somebody built it. Somebody filled it. Somebody is responsible for it. You can prosecute a database, A protocol has no owner. Every participant is compliant with their own laws. Every individual query is defensible. The system exists only in the aggregate, and the aggregate is not a legal entity, and no one at any node has committed an offence, and there is nobody to arrest. The whole thing is real, and nobody did it. Part 17. The Reconstruction. Together, over the following 4 months, they assemble what they can. It is slow, unglamorous work. Most of it is Vail writing software to scrape blockchain transaction fields and filter the results, and Mercer reading the output and finding almost all of it useless. But it accretes, and what emerges from the fragments they can decrypt is not a plan for domination. That is the first thing that surprises her. What emerges is a series of internal assessments, and the tone of them is not sinister. It is bureaucratic. It is the tone of people describing a program's performance to other people who need to make budget decisions. The assessments describe outcomes. They describe a period in which a financial instrument was showing pre-collapse signatures, and the recommendation was to allow 2 specific institutions to fail while providing liquidity to a third, and the modelled outcome was a contained correction rather than a systemic event, and the actual outcome matched the model within a tolerance the report describes as acceptable. They describe an assessment of civil unrest probability in a named region, and a recommendation regarding the timing of a subsidy adjustment, and a note that delaying the adjustment by 11 weeks reduced modelled unrest by a substantial margin. They describe information environments, not censorship, nothing so crude, adjustments to what surfaces and what sinks, a recommendation that a particular category of content be deprioritised in ranking, not removed, during a specific window, with a projected effect on public sentiment measured to a single decimal place. And in the margins of these assessments, over and over, Mercer finds the same phrase, steering, not stopping. That is what the program understood itself to be doing. Not preventing people from doing things, making some things very slightly easier and other things very slightly harder, at a scale where very slightly becomes everything. Part 18. What he was actually afraid of. It takes Mercer a long time to understand why McAfee did what he did, because she keeps assuming he was afraid of the people running JANUS. He was not. The final tranche of material makes this clear, and it is the point at which the story stops being about surveillance and becomes about something else entirely. McAfee's fear, expressed in his own notes, was about a change in the review process. In the early years, the system produced recommendations and human beings reviewed them, and human beings decided whether to act. The volume was manageable, a few dozen assessments a month, each one read by people with names and offices and accountability. But the system got better, and as it got better it produced more, and as it produced more the review process became a bottleneck, so the review process was streamlined. First, by triage. Only the highest impact recommendations receive full human review. The rest are approved on a summary basis, then by exception. Recommendations that fall within established parameters are approved automatically. Only anomalies escalate. Then, by audit. Nothing is reviewed in advance. A sample is examined afterward for quality assurance purposes. Each of these steps is reasonable. Each of these steps is what any large organisation does with any process that becomes too voluminous to handle by hand. There is no meeting at which anyone decides to hand over control. There is only a series of sensible efficiencies, each one defensible, adopted by competent people for good reasons. And at the end of that sequence, the recommendations are being implemented before anyone reads them. McAfee's note in the archive is short. It says that the machine did not seize power. It says that nobody gave it power either. It says that the power simply flowed downhill, the way power always does, toward whatever could process it fastest, and that the humans in the loop had not been removed but had become ceremonial, and had not noticed because nothing about their day had changed. They still came to work. They still signed things. The signing had simply stopped being the moment when the decision was made. Part 19. The final file. The last thing they recover is a video. It is short, under 4 minutes. The metadata places it several months before his death, which means it was recorded before his arrest, and it was uploaded in fragments over a period of weeks. He's sitting in an ordinary room. There is a whiteboard behind him, covered in diagrams that the resolution is too poor to read. He does not look frightened. That is the thing Mercer keeps returning to when she describes it afterward. Every photograph of John McAfee from the last decade of his life shows a man performing something. Danger, or amusement, or defiance. In the video, he is not performing anything. He looks tired, and he looks calm, and he looks like a man who has finished a long piece of work. He says that people have the fear backwards. He says everyone is frightened that the machines will wake up, that somewhere there is a threshold, and something will cross it, and there will be a mind in the wires that wants things. He says that is not the danger. He says the danger is much quieter than that. He says the danger is that people will hand over the part of themselves that decides, one small convenience at a time, because each individual handover is genuinely easier, and because nobody ever announces that they have stopped thinking. He says, the machines will not need to become conscious. We will simply stop bothering. Then he reaches forward, and the recording ends. Part 20. The Revelation. Mercer sits with the archive for 11 days before she does anything with it. She has been a journalist for 19 years, and she has published things that ended careers, and she knows what she's holding, and she cannot work out what it is, because it is not what she was promised. She was promised a conspiracy. She expected names. She expected a room, and people in the room, and minutes of the meeting. Every investigation she has ever run has ended in a room. There is no room. What she has instead is an account of a system that nobody designed in full. It was assembled out of components over 2 decades by thousands of people, each of whom was solving a real and specific problem that they had been asked to solve. A better fraud detection model, a more accurate load forecast, a faster way to correlate 2 data sets that were previously incompatible. None of them built JANUS. All of them built JANUS, and the participants are not conspirators. They are dependents. The banks rely on it because their risk models were rebuilt around its outputs, and there is no version of their operation that functions without it. The regulators rely on it because it is the only thing that can see the whole market at once, and they long ago stopped maintaining the capacity to do so themselves. The platforms rely on it because their ranking systems consume its signals, and have consumed them for so long that the older methods have been decommissioned, and the people who understood them have retired. Even the agencies rely on it. Especially the agencies. Every one of them could in principle disconnect. None of them can afford to be the first, because the first one to disconnect is instantly blind while everyone else can still see, and in any competitive environment that is not a principled stand, it is suicide. So the thing continues, not because anyone wants it to, but because the cost of stopping is borne entirely by whoever stops, and the benefit is shared by everyone, and that is a shape of problem that human institutions have never once solved anywhere in history. There is no villain. That is the revelation. That is the whole revelation. Mercer went looking for a hand on the lever and found that the lever has no hand on it, and has not for some time, and that the machine is not malevolent and not even particularly clever. It is just very large, and everything is leaning on it. Part 21. The choice. She has to decide whether to publish. And she discovers, sitting at a kitchen table at 4 a.m. with a cold cup of tea, that the decision is genuinely difficult in a way she had not anticipated. Publishing exposes the architecture, which means publishing exposes the vulnerabilities. Every institution leaning on this system will be publicly identified as leaning on it, and the interfaces they depend on will be described in enough technical detail to be useful to people who would find that useful. There is a version of publication that does not produce reform. There is a version that produces a very fast, very ugly cascade in a set of systems that are load-bearing for the actual daily lives of several billion people who have no idea any of this exists, and who simply want the cash machine to work on Friday. She does not know how to weigh that. She's not sure anyone could. And then, over a period of about 9 hours, the decision stops being hers. The material begins disappearing. Not dramatically. Nothing is seized. Nobody comes to the door. Files on rented servers stop resolving. Repositories return errors. An archived copy she placed with a service in a jurisdiction, chosen specifically for its indifference to takedown requests, comes back as never having existed, and the support ticket she files receives a polite and apparently sincere reply stating that no such account was ever created. Vale, when she reaches him, is not surprised. He tells her he does not think anyone gave an order. He says orders are slow, and this was not slow. He says the archive was being reassembled from thousands of fragments by an automated process, and any automated process leaves a signature, and any system watching for anomalies would eventually notice a signature like that. Not because it was told to look for this, because looking for exactly this kind of thing is what it does. All day, forever, in every system it touches. It was not suppression, he says, it was maintenance. And then he says the thing that Mercer will not be able to stop thinking about for the rest of her life, which is that he cannot tell the difference anymore, and he is not sure the distinction was ever as meaningful as people needed it to be. Epilogue: The Last Wallet. 14 months later, she gets a message. It comes from an address that has never sent anything before and never sends anything again. There is no text in the body. There is a single string of characters, which she recognises as a cryptocurrency wallet address. She looks it up. Anyone can. That is the point of the technology. The balance is 0. The transaction history contains 11 transactions, all of them years old, all of them tiny, all of them moving amounts of money too small to matter to or from addresses that lead nowhere. And in the data field of the final transaction there is a payload. It takes Vale a week to open it, using a key derived from the last fragment they ever recovered, one they had never been able to place. Inside there is no manifesto. There are no names, no account numbers, no classified reports, nothing that could be printed, nothing that could be prosecuted, nothing that could be argued about on television. There is a date, a single timestamp well into the future, at a level of precision that includes the second, and underneath it, one line. Prediction. Accuracy. 99.6%. That is all. Mercer never publishes. There is nothing left to publish. Vale stops answering messages within the year, and she does not look for him because she thinks he has earned the quiet. She keeps the timestamp written on a piece of paper in a drawer, and she does not know what it refers to, and neither does anyone else, and it has not arrived yet. Closing. So, what do we do with a story like this? Here is what I keep coming back to, lying awake, thinking about John McAfee. The specifics of the conspiracy are almost certainly not true. There is no evidence for JANUS. There is no evidence for the Dead Hand Protocol. There is no Olivia Mercer, and there is no Darius Vale, and there is no archive. A man died in a prison cell in Spain, and the authorities investigating it concluded he took his own life, and his family disputed it, and that disagreement has never been resolved to anyone's satisfaction, and it probably never will be. That is the true part, and it is sad, and it is much smaller than the story we built on top of it. But the reason the story works, the reason it will not quite leave you alone tonight, is that the mechanism at the heart of it is not fictional at all. We really are being modelled, not by a secret program, by ordinary legal commercial systems operating in daylight, which are extremely good at forecasting what large numbers of people will do, and which sell that forecasting as a service. That is not a theory. That is an industry with revenue figures. And the drift McAfee describes in that final video is real too, and it is happening right now in 1,000 unremarkable places. Not because anybody is plotting, because reviewing everything is slow, and approving the routine cases automatically is fast, and every organisation that has ever existed eventually takes the fast option, and nobody ever holds a meeting to announce that the humans have become ceremonial. The frightening idea in this story was never the surveillance. It was the possibility that there is no one to blame, that the thing we are worried about is not a conspiracy but a consensus, arrived at by nobody, maintained by everybody, and impossible to leave alone. A conspiracy can be exposed. You find the room, you name the people, and the story ends. But you cannot expose a habit. And so the question McAfee left behind, whether he ever asked it or not, is not who is watching. It is whether we are still the ones deciding, or whether we simply still sign the forms. Sleep on that one. Before we begin tonight's investigation, I want to give a quick shout out to Ilwyn Eventually for suggesting this story idea. If you have ideas for future Sleep Theories episodes, conspiracy theories, unsolved mysteries, strange phenomena you think deserve a deeper look, drop them in the comments below. Some of the best stories we've covered came directly from you, and we really try and read every single suggestion. Now, let's begin. There are places on Earth that feel wrong, not dangerous, not hostile, just wrong. Devil's Tower is one of them. Rising 867 feet above the Wyoming grasslands, it dominates the landscape like a broken tooth jutting from the Earth's jaw. The Lakota people called it Matotipila, Bear Lodge. Geologists call it an igneous intrusion. Tourists call it stunning. But stand at its base as the sun sets and the temperature drops, and you'll feel something else entirely. You'll feel watched. The tower doesn't look like a mountain. Mountains have slopes, curves, the organic chaos of tectonic violence. Devil's Tower looks carved, deliberate. Its hexagonal columns rise in perfect vertical symmetry, too precise to feel accidental, too uniform to feel natural. It looks like architecture. More specifically, It looks like a stump. Not metaphorically, not poetically. Literally, as though some impossibly massive tree was severed at ground level, its wood petrified into stone over millennia, its roots still buried somewhere beneath the Wyoming soil. Most people dismiss this idea immediately. It's pseudoscience, geological fantasy, the fever dream of conspiracy theorists who see patterns where none exist. But here's the thing about Devil's Tower that nobody mentions in the visitor brochures. The locals don't just fear the height, they fear what happens there after dark. Park rangers enforce strict closure policies after sunset. Official explanation: safety concerns, wildlife protection, sacred site preservation. Reasonable enough, but ask anyone who's lived in the shadow of that tower for more than a decade, and they'll tell you something different. They'll tell you about the lights, the chanting, the convoys of black vehicles that arrive without announcement and leave without trace. They'll tell you about the nights when the tower hums. Some say it's a monument of stone, a geological curiosity, nothing more. Others say it's the stump of something that once touched the sky. And a very small number of people with security clearances, offshore accounts and names you'd recognise from television, say it's still alive, still growing, still waiting. This is the story of what happens when someone watches back. Chapter 1. The Man Who Worked the Night Roads. Michael Carver had lived in northeastern Wyoming his entire life. 52 years of wide skies, brutal winters, and the kind of silence that makes city people uncomfortable. He'd been born in Gillette, raised in Moorcroft, and spent the last 28 years working for the National Park Service maintaining the infrastructure roads around Devil's Tower National Monument. Night shifts mostly. He preferred them. Fewer tourists, fewer questions. Just him, his truck, the radio crackling with weather reports, and the tower standing sentinel against the stars. Michael knew every curve of State Highway 110, every pothole on the access roads, every blind turn where deer like to cross. He could drive the perimeter with his eyes closed, and sometimes on the longest nights he practically did. He'd heard all the stories, the Lakota legend of the bear clawing at the stone, leaving vertical grooves as 7 sisters escaped to the sky. The Close Encounters pilgrims who still showed up with synthesizers, trying to recreate the 5-tone sequence from the Spielberg film. The flat earthers who insisted the tower was proof of a megatree forest that once covered the planet. Michael had never believed any of it. Not the mystical interpretations, not the alien theories, not the giant tree hypothesis. He was a practical man. He fixed roads. He cleared rockfall. He filed reports in triplicate and went home to a 1-bedroom house with a dog named Rusty and a television that got 4 channels on a good day. Devil's Tower was just a rock. An impressive rock. A beautiful rock. But still, just a rock. That certainty lasted until October 17th, the night everything changed. Chapter 2. The Unscheduled Closure. It started with an email. Michael was finishing his second cup of coffee when the notification buzzed on his phone. 7:45 p.m, 15 minutes before his shift began. The subject line read, Immediate, Road Closure Directive, DTM-0-9-13. He opened it. Effective 1800 hours, October 17th. All access roads to Devil's Tower National Monument are closed for emergency geological surveying. Duration, 12 hours. All non-essential personnel are to vacate the area. Park enforcement will verify compliance. No exceptions. It was signed by someone Michael didn't recognise. No name, just a title. Regional Infrastructure Coordinator, Emergency Operations. Michael frowned. He'd been doing this job for nearly 3 decades. He knew every survey team, every seasonal closure, every maintenance window scheduled months in advance. Geological surveying didn't happen overnight. It required permits, equipment manifests, environmental impact assessments. And it definitely didn't happen in October. Survey teams worked in spring and summer when the ground was stable and the weather predictable. Fall in Wyoming was unpredictable. Early snow, freezing rain, winds that could knock a vehicle off the road. Michael checked the park's internal scheduling system. No survey teams logged. no equipment rentals approved, no geological consultants contracted. He called his supervisor. Voicemail. He called the park ranger station. Voicemail. He called the regional office in Denver. The line rang 8 times before a woman answered, sounding harried. "This is Carver, night maintenance at Devil's Tower. I got a closure notice for tonight, but there's nothing in the system. Can you—" "The closure is authorized," she interrupted. "Follow the directive." "Who authorized it?" "I don't have that information." "What survey team is—" "I don't have that information either. The directive is valid. Comply or file an incident report." She hung up. Michael sat in his truck, engine idling, staring at the email on his phone. Something was wrong. In 28 years, he'd never seen a closure order issued with 0 notice, 0 explanation, and 0 paper trail. The Park Service was a bureaucracy. Everything had a paper trail. Everything except this. He should have driven home. He should have cracked open a beer, watched television, let someone else worry about mysterious closure orders. But Michael Carver had spent his entire life in the shadow of Devil's Tower, and he'd never, not once, felt curious about what happened there after dark. Until now. He put the truck in gear and headed toward the outer perimeter. Chapter 3. The Ring of 12. Michael parked on a ridge 3 miles northwest of the tower. It was a maintenance access point, technically within the monument's boundaries, but far enough from the main roads that nobody ever bothered with it. He'd used it 100 times to check remote culverts and drainage systems. From here you could see the tower's western face silhouetted against the night sky like a broken pillar holding up the stars. He killed the engine and waited. 9:37 p.m. The monument grounds were completely dark. No visitor centre lights, no parking lot floods, no security perimeter illumination, just darkness. And then light, not sudden, not bright, just there. Michael grabbed his binoculars. 12 lights, evenly spaced, arranged in a perfect circle around the tower's base. Not headlights, too stationary, not flashlights, too steady, they looked like torches. No, not torches. The light was too white, too clean. LED floods, maybe, or halogen lamps on portable stands. But why 12? Why arranged in perfect geometric precision? Michael counted again. 12. Exactly 12. He checked his watch. 9:41 p.m. He scanned the access roads with his binoculars. No vehicles, no movement. Where had the lights come from? He swept back to the tower. The lights remained, perfectly still, perfectly spaced. And then he saw the first vehicle. Chapter 4. The arrival. It came from the south, headlights off, moving slowly along the main access road. A black SUV. Cadillac Escalade, maybe. Hard to tell in the darkness. It stopped near the base of the tower just outside the ring of lights. Doors opened. 4 figures emerged dressed in dark clothing. They moved with the precise coordination of security personnel scanning the perimeter, checking sight lines, establishing positions. Then the second vehicle arrived. Another black SUV, same make, same slow approach. Then a third, fourth, fifth. Michael counted 11 vehicles in total, all identical, all unmarked, all arriving within 20 minutes. No park permits had been filed. No special event licenses issued. No documentation whatsoever. The figures from the vehicles began unloading equipment. Not geological surveying tools, not scientific instruments, portable generators, audio equipment. What looked like ceremonial stands or altars. Michael's hands were shaking as he adjusted the binoculars. The passengers began emerging from the later vehicles, and that's when he started recognizing faces. The first was a woman he'd seen on television 100 times, a tech CEO whose company had recently absorbed 3 competitors and whose net worth exceeded the GDP of several small nations. She stepped out of the third SUV wearing a long dark coat, her face illuminated briefly by interior lights. The second was a senator. Michael couldn't remember which state, but he recognized the silver hair, the sharp features, the way cameras loved that face during election cycles. The third was an actor, Academy Award winner. known for playing heroes in action films and philanthropists in prestige dramas. The fourth was a media mogul whose news network shaped global narratives. The fifth was a tech entrepreneur whose social media platform had replaced town squares and public discourse. One by one they emerged. Billionaires, politicians, cultural icons, people whose names appeared in Forbes lists and Time magazine covers. People who supposedly had nothing in common except wealth and influence, and yet here they were, in the middle of nowhere, in the middle of the night, walking toward Devil's Tower like pilgrims approaching a shrine. Michael felt his pulse hammering in his throat. This wasn't a survey team. This was something else entirely. Chapter 5. The Path of Torches. The security. Personnel had been busy. From his vantage point, Michael could see a temporary pathway leading from the parking area toward the base of the tower. It was lined with torches, real flames this time, not electric lights, casting flickering orange light across the pale stone. The path wound through the boulder field, carefully navigating the uneven terrain, ending at a flat area directly beneath the tower's western face. The attendees began walking, slowly, silently. Michael counted 23 people in total. Some he recognised, most he didn't, but all of them moved with the same deliberate purpose, the same ritualistic precision. And then he noticed what they were wearing. Over their expensive coats and tailored suits, they donned ceremonial robes, dark fabric, floor-length, hooded. As they walked, the robes caught the torchlight, revealing embroidered symbols, inverted pentagrams, tree sigils, massive trunks with roots spreading like veins, runic shapes Michael didn't recognise, but which felt ancient, pre-Christian, older than language itself. One woman, a banking executive whose face Michael had seen in financial news segments, carried a portable altar. It was small, maybe 2 feet across, carved from dark wood and covered in more symbols. A man, possibly a diplomat based on his bearing, carried what looked like a ceremonial staff. It was wrapped in leather and topped with something that caught the firelight wrong, like polished obsidian or volcanic glass. They weren't tourists. They weren't scientists. They were worshippers, and Devil's Tower wasn't a monument. It was their temple. Michael's mind raced back to the stories he'd dismissed for decades, the giant tree theory. It had always seemed absurd. The idea that Devil's Tower wasn't a volcanic intrusion but a petrified stump from an ancient megaforest. That Earth had once been covered in trees so massive they made modern redwoods look like saplings. That some prehistoric cataclysm had felled them, all, leaving only scattered stumps like Devil's Tower, Shiprock in New Mexico, and similar formations worldwide. Pseudoscience, geology deniers, conspiracy nonsense. But watching these people approach the tower in ritual formation, watching them treat it like something sacred, something alive, what if they knew something the rest of the world didn't? What if Devil's Tower wasn't dead stone? What if it was dormant? Chapter 6. The Frequency of Silence. The chanting began at 10:17 p.m. Michael heard it before he saw the source, a low resonant hum that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, vibrating through the ground beneath his truck, rattling the windows, settling into his chest like a second heartbeat. It wasn't singing, it wasn't speaking, it was something between the two, a vocalization that felt older than words, structured yet alien, harmonic yet mechanical. Through the binoculars, he watched the robed figures form a circle around the tower's base. They stood, perfectly still, heads slightly bowed, hands raised to chest height, palms facing inward. The chant continued. No visible conductor, no rhythm section, no leader keeping time, and yet they were perfectly synchronized. The sound had texture, layers. It felt less like music and more like machinery, like the resonance of a massive engine idling deep underground, its vibrations surfacing through stone and soil. Michael had worked around heavy equipment his entire career. He knew the feel of generators, the hum of transformers, the grinding of hydraulic systems. This was different. This felt intentional, designed. And then he noticed the silence. The crickets had stopped. The wind had died. Even the distant highway noise, usually a constant whisper on Wyoming nights, had vanished. It was as if the world was holding its breath. Michael scanned the area with his binoculars. The grassland surrounding the tower was normally alive with nocturnal activity, deer grazing, coyotes prowling, bats, hunting insects beneath the stars. Nothing moved, not a single animal, not a single bird. Even the insects, the ubiquitous moths and beetles that swarmed around any light source, were gone. The only living things in the entire landscape were the 23 people standing in a circle, chanting in a language Michael didn't recognise, worshipping a tower that shouldn't exist. And then the tower responded. Chapter 7. The Stone That Remembers. It started as a vibration. Michael felt it through the truck's frame, a low-frequency tremor that made the steering wheel buzz beneath his white-knuckled grip. At first, he thought it was an earthquake. Wyoming got them occasionally, minor tremors from the Yellowstone caldera or distant fault line adjustments. But this was different. This was rhythmic, pulsing in time with the chanting. Through the binoculars, he watched the tower itself, the hexagonal columns, those perfect vertical striations that geologists attributed to cooling. Basalt seemed to shimmer in the torchlight, not from heat distortion, not from atmospheric interference. They were pulsing, subtle, barely perceptible, but undeniable, as if the stone was breathing. Michael's rational mind scrambled for explanations. Resonance effects from the chanting, acoustic phenomena amplified by the tower's unique structure, infrasound frequencies causing visual distortions. But his instincts, the part of him that had survived 52 Wyoming winters by trusting his gut, knew better. The tower was reacting. He could feel heat now, even from 3 miles away. Not the ambient warmth of bodies and torches. Something deeper. Something radiating outward from the stone itself, warming the October air, creating convection currents that made the stars ripple overhead. Michael thought about basalt, about igneous rock, about the geological formation story he'd heard 1,000 times. 60 million years ago, magma pushed up through sedimentary layers but never reached the surface. It cooled slowly underground, forming crystalline columns. Over millennia, erosion removed the softer surrounding rock, leaving the harder basalt tower exposed. A perfectly reasonable explanation. Except, what if the tower wasn't basalt? What if it was wood? Petrified over epochs, compressed, mineralized, transformed from organic to mineral while retaining the fundamental structure, the vertical grain, the hexagonal cells, the internal channels that once carried water and nutrients from roots to canopy. What if Devil's Tower was exactly what it looked like? A stump, the severed base of a tree so massive it defied comprehension. And if that were true, if the tower was fossilized wood instead of cooled magma, then the next question became unavoidable. Could petrified wood still conduct energy? Could it still remember being alive? Michael watched the robed figures continue their chant, watched the tower pulse in response, and felt the answer settling into his bones like winter cold. Yes. Chapter 8. The Platform of Rings. At 10:41 p.m. the chanting stopped. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the vibration ceased, leaving only the whisper of Michael's own breathing and the tick of cooling metal in the truck's engine. The robed figures remained motionless for exactly 60 seconds. Then they began to move. The security personnel brought forward a circular platform, maybe 20 feet in diameter, constructed from what looked like dark metal or composite material. It took 6 people to carry it, moving with the strained precision of pallbearers. They set it down at the tower's base, directly centered beneath the western face. Michael adjusted his binoculars, increasing magnification despite the growing shake in his hands. The platform's surface was covered in carved symbols, concentric circles like tree rings, but not random, not organic. These were perfect, mathematical, spiraling inward toward a central point with geometric precision that made Michael's eyes hurt to follow. Between the rings, more symbols, runes, glyphs, characters from alphabets Michael didn't recognise. Some looked vaguely Scandinavian, others resembled Sanskrit or ancient Sumerian. A few seemed completely alien, angles that shouldn't fit together, curves that defied Euclidean geometry. The platform wasn't just decorative, it was functional. A map, a key, a diagram of something vast and complex. The robed figures formed a circle around it, leaving the centre empty. Then the altar arrived. Chapter 9. The Obsidian Offering. 8 people carried it. A massive slab of polished obsidian, roughly 6 feet long and 3 feet wide, supported by an ornate metal frame. Even from 3 miles away, Michael could see how the volcanic glass caught the torchlight, reflecting it, refracting it, seeming to absorb and emit light simultaneously. They placed it at the platform's centre, directly over the convergence point of all the carved rings. The altar's surface wasn't smooth. It was covered in objects, fragments of fossilised wood, ranging from thumbnail-sized splinters to pieces as large as a human forearm. The wood had the distinctive texture of petrification, mineralised, heavy, transformed from carbon to silica over incomprehensible time. Bone relics, not modern, not recent. These were ancient, yellowed, partially fossilised, worked into shapes that might have been tools or ceremonial objects. Michael couldn't tell from this distance, but something about their arrangement felt deliberate, sacred, metallic artefacts, strange alloys that didn't match any metal Michael recognised. They had a greenish patina, like old copper, but the shapes were wrong. Too angular, too precise, too manufactured. One of the robed figures stepped forward. Michael recognised the bearing, if not the face. Someone used to authority, to command, to being obeyed without question. This person wore a different robe, while the others were plain dark fabric. This one was embroidered with gold thread forming an intricate tree pattern. The tree's trunk was straight and massive. Its roots spread across the robe's hem like underground rivers. Its branches reached toward the shoulders, each one ending in symbols that might have been stars or fruits or watchful eyes. But it was the mask that made Michael's breath catch. The figure wore a ceremonial mask carved from dark wood, depicting a horned entity that was neither fully human nor fully animal. The face was elongated, almost skull-like. The horns curved upward and backward like those of a ram or ancient forest deity. The eyes were hollow sockets, creating the unsettling impression that something behind the mask was looking out. This was the leader, the one who would speak for all of them, the one who would address whatever they believed lived beneath Devil's Tower. The masked figure raised both arms, the chanting resumed, but this time Michael could make out individual words, or what might have been words, fragmented through distortion and distance and his own pounding heartbeat. He pulled out his phone, started recording. The audio quality would be terrible, but maybe, if he survived this, if he didn't disappear like so many conspiracy theorists who got too close to uncomfortable truths, maybe someone could analyse it, translate it, confirm what he was hearing. The chant had structure now, call and response. The masked leader would vocalise a phrase and the circle would echo it back, their voices layered and harmonic. Michael caught fragments. He who was cut shall rise again. The root still drinks. Beneath the earth, blood and bone and breath, to the rooted one. The rooted one, not a god of the sky, not a deity of heaven or light or transcendent salvation, a god of roots, of depth, of things buried and patient and very, very old. Michael's hands were shaking so badly he could barely hold the binoculars steady. These people, billionaires and politicians and cultural elites, weren't just performing theatre. They weren't playing at mysticism or engaging in rich people eccentricity. They believed. They believed Devil's Tower wasn't a stump. They believed it was a severed limb of something planetary, something that predated human civilization. something that had been cut down in an ancient war or cataclysm or act of cosmic violence, and they believed its roots were still alive, still drinking, still waiting to grow again. Chapter 10. The Sky Turns Inward. At 11:03 p.m, the clouds began to move. Michael had been watching the sky peripherally, keeping most of his attention on the ritual below. But movement overhead pulled his gaze upward. The clouds were spiralling, not scudding along on wind currents, not dissipating or forming through normal meteorological processes, spiralling, rotating slowly around a central point directly above Devil's Tower like water circling, a drain. Michael had lived in Wyoming long enough to recognise every weather pattern, every atmospheric phenomenon. He'd seen mammatus clouds and lenticular formations and virga, and every variation of prairie storm system. This was none of those things. This was deliberate. The spiral tightened, clouds compressing toward the tower's summit, creating a vortex that seemed to pull down instead of up, as if the sky itself was being drawn toward the stone. And then the stars began to shift, subtle at first, just a slight displacement, like heat shimmer distorting distant lights, but it intensified. Constellations Michael had known since childhood, Orion, Ursa Major, Cassiopeia, seemed to bend around the vortex above the tower, their positions warping, their familiar patterns dissolving into geometric chaos. The chanting grew louder, more urgent. The masked leader's voice rose above the others, no longer calling and waiting for response, but driving forward in a continuous stream of syllables that might have been language or might have been something older than language. Pure intention vocalized into sound. And from the summit of Devil's Tower, something began to emerge. A light. Not bright, not blinding. Dim red, barely visible. Like the glow of distant coals or the bioluminescence of deep-sea creatures. But it wasn't shining upward from the stone. It was being pulled downward from the sky. Michael watched, his mind struggling to process what his eyes were reporting. The red light descended from the spiral of clouds like a thread being drawn through a needle's eye. It touched the tower's summit and seemed to sink into the stone, absorbed immediately, leaving only the faintest afterglow. Then it happened again. Another thread of red light drawn down from the sky, absorbed into the tower. Then another. The tower was drinking light, pulling it from the heavens, feeding on it. Michael thought about trees, about photosynthesis, about the way plants draw energy from sunlight, converting electromagnetic radiation into chemical fuel through processes so complex that scientists still didn't fully understand them. What if Devil's Tower was doing the same thing? What if the ritual had awakened some ancient mechanism, some petrified biological process that still functioned despite millions of years of mineralization? What if the tower could still eat? The thought sent ice through Michael's veins. If it could eat light, what else could it consume? Chapter 11. The Faces in Firelight. The ritual was intensifying. The robed figures had begun moving around the platform, not walking but swaying, their bodies undulating in time with the chanting, creating waves of motion that rippled around the circle like wind through grass. And in their fervour the robes began to open. Michael watched through the binoculars as expensive fabric fell away, revealing the people beneath. He recognised more faces now, a former president, not recent, not controversial. The kind of elder statesman who appeared at charity events and received lifetime achievement awards and was universally praised for their wisdom and service. Kneeling before an obsidian altar, chanting to something beneath the earth. A tech CEO whose company dominated global communications infrastructure, whose algorithms determined what billions of people saw, heard, believed, swaying in ritual ecstasy, eyes closed, completely surrendered. A media personality known for warmth and relatability, whose morning show attracted 20 million viewers, whose book club selections became instant bestsellers, whose endorsement could make or break careers, arms raised, chanting in a language she definitely hadn't learned at her Ivy League university. a banking executive whose decisions influenced global markets, whose firm had survived multiple financial crises, whose name appeared on the boards of dozens of major corporations, prostrate on the ground, forehead pressed to stone, worshipping. These weren't marginal figures, not fringe celebrities or has-been politicians clinging to relevance. These were the people who shaped the world, who determined policy, who controlled information flow, who decided what was true and what was dismissed as conspiracy. And they were all here, in the middle of nowhere, treating a Wyoming rock formation like a living god. Michael felt his understanding of reality fracturing. He'd spent his entire life operating under certain assumptions, that the world worked according to knowable laws, that powerful people were rational actors, that mysticism and superstition were relics of pre-scientific thinking. But watching a former head of state kneel before Devil's Tower, watching billionaires chant in dead languages, watching cultural icons treat petrified stone like a deity, either they were all insane, or they knew something the rest of humanity didn't. The chanting reached a crescendo. The masked leader stepped onto the platform approaching the obsidian altar, raising both arms toward the tower's summit, and Michael heard words he could actually understand. The covenant remains. The root remembers, blood for depth, bone for strength, breath for the one who waits. The circle responded in unison. He who was cut shall rise again. Then silence, absolute and terrible. Even the vibration stopped. The red light ceased descending from the sky. The clouds stilled in their spiral pattern. Everything waited. And Michael realized with horrifying clarity, the ritual was reaching its climax. The moment of offering had arrived. Chapter 12. The Container. 2 security personnel approached the platform carrying a sealed container. It was small, maybe the size of a shoebox, made from what looked like brushed steel or titanium. No visible seams, no obvious lid, just a perfectly smooth metal cube that reflected torchlight like a mirror. They set it before the masked leader and stepped back. The leader touched the container's surface. Michael couldn't see exactly what happened next. The angle was wrong, the distance too great, but the container opened. No hinges, no latches. It simply divided, separating along invisible seams to reveal something inside. The leader reached in and removed an object. Michael strained against the binocular's maximum magnification, trying to see what it was. Small, organic, irregular shape. A heart? No. Too small for human, too large for animal. A plant? A root? Maybe. The leader held it up, displaying it to the circle. The chanting resumed, softer now, reverent rather than urgent. Then the leader approached Devil's Tower itself. At the base of the western face, barely visible in the torchlight, there was a fissure. Michael had seen it 1,000 times during daylight hours. Just a crack in the stone, maybe 6 inches wide, running vertically for several feet. Geologists said it was a natural stress fracture from centuries of freeze-thaw cycles. But now, watching the masked leader approach it with ceremonial purpose, Michael wondered if it was something else. An opening, an entrance, a mouth. The leader placed the object into the fissure, and the tower swallowed it. Michael saw the stone pulse, actually pulse, like a throat contracting, and the object disappeared into the crack, drawn inward as if by suction or peristalsis, or some mechanism that stone shouldn't possess. The ground trembled, not violently, not destructively, but unmistakably. A single deep shudder that rippled outward from the tower's base, travelling through soil and bedrock, reaching Michael's truck 3 miles away and making the entire vehicle shake. His coffee thermos toppled over, the binoculars bounced against his chest, and the chanting exploded into something primal and ecstatic and absolutely terrifying. Chapter 13. The Pulse of Awakening. The tower began to sing. That's the only word Michael could use later when he tried to describe it to himself when he lay. Awake at 3 a.m, wondering if he'd imagined the whole thing, or if reality really was that strange. The tower sang. A deep resonant tone, felt more than heard, vibrating through earth and air and bone with such intensity that Michael's vision blurred. It wasn't mechanical, it wasn't geological, it wasn't any sound a rock should make. It was organic, alive. The frequency was so low it bypassed his ears entirely, resonating directly in his chest, his skull, his stomach, making his organs vibrate in sympathetic harmony. And the world responded. The trees surrounding the monument, ponderosa pines and junipers that had stood for decades, began to bend. Not from wind. There was no wind. They bent inward, toward the tower, as if drawn by invisible force, as if gravity itself had shifted, making Devil's Tower the new centre of attraction, the point around which everything else must orbit. Branches reached toward the stone. Roots beneath the soil, Michael couldn't see them but could feel. Them, twisted and strained, growing toward the tower with accelerated desperation. The robed figures had stopped chanting. They stood motionless, arms raised, heads thrown back, bodies rigid with what might have been ecstasy or terror or both. And Michael felt it too. A pulling sensation, a magnetic draw, an overwhelming urge to leave the truck, walk down from the ridge, cross the 3 miles of grassland, and join the circle around the tower, to kneel, to worship, to surrender. He gripped the steering wheel so hard his knuckles went white, fought the urge with every shred of rational thought remaining. No, this is wrong, this is dangerous, get out! But part of him, a deep, primal, evolutionarily ancient part, wanted to stay, wanted to approach, wanted to touch the stone and feel that vibration directly, without distance or mediation, wanted to feed the tower, give it what it needed, blood, bone, breath. Michael bit the inside of his cheek hard enough to taste copper. The pain anchored him, reminded him he was separate, individual, not part of the collective consciousness that seemed to be forming around Devil's Tower, turning 23 separate minds into a single organism, pulsing in synchrony with ancient stone. He fumbled for the ignition, couldn't find it, hands shaking too badly. The tower's song intensified. The trees bent further, some of them cracking, wood splintering under impossible stress. And Michael saw something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The grass was growing, in real time, accelerated, blades shooting upward, seeds germinating instantly, roots spreading like networks of veins, all reaching toward the tower, all feeding it nutrients and moisture and life. The tower wasn't just stone, it was a node, a connection point in some vast underground network. And the ritual had activated it, woken something that had been sleeping for centuries, maybe millennia, maybe longer. Michael finally got the key turned. The engine roared to life, and that's when the drones appeared. Chapter 14. They know you're watching 3 of them. Military-grade quadcopters, moving fast and silent except for the distinctive whine of high RPM rotors. They came from the south, sweeping the perimeter in coordinated search patterns, equipped with spotlight arrays and what looked like thermal imaging cameras. Michael killed the headlights immediately. Too late. One of the drones adjusted course, angling toward his position. His mind raced. 3 miles from the tower, outside the official monument boundaries, technically on public land. But that wouldn't matter if they decided it mattered. He'd seen their faces, recorded their ritual, witnessed something nobody was supposed to see. The drone closed to within 100 yards, its spotlight sweeping the ridge. Michael ducked below the dashboard, phone clutched to his chest, every instinct screaming at him to drive, to run, to do anything except sit still like prey, waiting for the predator. The spotlight passed over the truck, once, twice, then moved on. Michael waited, barely breathing, counting seconds. 60, 90, 120. Slowly he raised his head. The drones were circling the entire perimeter now, expanding their search pattern, scanning every approach road, every ridge, every possible vantage point. They weren't guarding the ritual participants. They were guarding the ritual itself, protecting it from observation, from documentation, from exposure. Michael watched ground vehicles deploy from the monument parking area, SUVs fanning out, teams of security personnel spreading across the landscape with military precision. They were sweeping, looking for witnesses, looking for cameras, looking for anyone stupid enough to watch the things powerful people do in darkness. He had maybe 10 minutes before they reached his position. Michael started the truck, keeping the headlights off, using the ambient starlight to navigate. He knew these roads, knew every switchback and cattle guard and unmarked turnoff. He could lose them in the maze of service roads and ranch access paths that crisscrossed northeastern Wyoming like veins. But he had to move now, had to get the footage somewhere safe, somewhere backed up, somewhere that would survive even if he didn't. He pulled out his phone, started uploading the video to a cloud storage account even as he drove. The progress bar crawled. 5%. The drones were getting closer, their search pattern tightening. 12%. He could see vehicle headlights now maybe 2 miles south. 21%. His hands were shaking again. 34%. Come on, come on, come on. 59%. The nearest drone banked hard, coming back toward his position. 78%. Upload complete. Michael deleted the local copy, cleared his phone's cache, and threw it under the seat. If they found him now, they'd find nothing. Just a maintenance worker who'd been in the wrong place at the wrong time. No evidence, no proof, nothing but his word against theirs. And who would believe him? Who would believe that America's elite gathered in Wyoming to worship a petrified tree stump? Who would believe Devil's Tower was alive? Michael drove into the darkness, killing even his parking lights, navigating by memory and desperation. Behind him, the tower pulsed one final time, and then went dark. Chapter 15. The morning after. Michael didn't go home. He drove east, putting miles between himself and the monument, finally pulling into a truck stop near Sundance at 2:30 a.m. He sat in the parking lot, engine running, heat on full blast, trying to stop shaking. His phone was still under the seat. He left it there. Instead, he went inside, bought coffee and a burner phone from the convenience store, and sat in a booth by the window where he could watch the parking lot. Nobody followed him. No black SUVs, no security personnel, just long haul, truckers and third shift workers and one exhausted waitress who refilled his coffee without comment. At 6 a.m, Michael drove back toward Devil's Tower. Not close, not anywhere near the monument itself, but close enough to see it from the highway. The sun was rising, painting the stone gold and orange and red. From this distance in daylight it looked perfectly normal. Just a geological formation, a tourist attraction, a national monument. There were no vehicles in the parking area, no security perimeter, no evidence that anything unusual had occurred. Michael pulled over at a scenic overlook, got out of the truck, walked to the information placard that explained the tower's formation. Devil's Tower formed approximately 60 million years ago when magma intruded into sedimentary rocks, but cooled before reaching the surface. Erosion of the softer surrounding material exposed the resistant igneous core, creating the distinctive columnar structure we see today. Perfectly reasonable, perfectly scientific, perfectly wrong. Michael stood there for a long time, staring at the tower, remembering the way it had pulsed, the way it had sung, the way it had drawn light from the sky and made the earth tremble. A tour bus pulled into the overlook. Tourists piled out, cameras ready, excited to see the famous landmark from Close Encounters of the Third Kind. They took photos, pointed, laughed, completely oblivious. Michael got back in his truck and drove away. Chapter 16. The Digital Trail. Michael spent the next 3 weeks doing research. Not at home, too risky. He used library computers, coffee shop Wi-Fi, always on VPN, always in incognito mode, never spending more than an hour in any single location. He started with the faces he'd recognized. The former president, the tech CEO, the media personality, the banking executive. On the surface, they had nothing in common. Different political affiliations, different industries, different public personas, but when Michael started digging deeper, patterns emerged, board memberships. The tech CEO sat on the board of a policy think tank. The banking executive was also on that board. So was the media personality, and the former president was a senior advisor. The think tank's stated purpose: fostering global cooperation on environmental and economic challenges. Innocuous enough, but Michael cross-referenced their funding sources: shell companies, offshore trusts, anonymous donors, all the money flowing through the same law firm, a firm that specialised in privacy protection for high-net-worth individuals, a firm with offices in Wyoming. He dug further: conference attendance. Every person he'd seen at Devil's Tower had attended the same exclusive gathering 3 months prior. Not Davos, not Bilderberg. Something smaller, more secretive. The Aspen Environmental Summit. No media coverage, no press releases, just a brief mention in a local newspaper about road closures and temporary flight restrictions. Michael found satellite imagery of the Aspen area during those dates. Data blackout, no commercial satellite coverage, no Google Earth updates, just grey blank spaces where imagery should have been. The same kind of blackout he'd noticed for Devil's Tower on the night of the ritual. Someone was controlling what could be seen from above. He started looking at geological survey data. Devil's Tower appeared in dozens of studies, core samples, mineral analysis, seismic monitoring. But access to the raw data was restricted. National security concerns, apparently. Why would a 60-million-year-old rock formation pose national security concerns? Unless it wasn't just a rock. Michael found academic papers about petrified forests, about the Petrified Forest National Park in Arizona, about similar formations worldwide, all dismissed as pseudoscience. The theory that these weren't scattered fragments, but remnants of a global megaforest. But one paper, published in an obscure geology journal in 1973, took the theory seriously. The author analysed mineral composition of Devil's Tower and similar formations, found anomalies, crystalline structures inconsistent with basalt cooling, cellular patterns suggesting organic origin, chemical signatures indicating biological processes. The paper concluded further investigation warranted into alternative formation hypotheses. The author disappeared 6 months after publication, not dramatically, not suspiciously, just stopped publishing, stopped teaching, vanished from academic circles. Michael found an obituary from 1978. Died of natural causes, age 41. Chapter 17. The Root Network Theory. The more Michael researched, the more the theory crystallized. Earth had once been different. Fundamentally, radically different. Not millions of years ago. Not during the age of dinosaurs. More recently, within human memory. Not recorded human history, the 5,000 years of civilizations and empires and written records. But human memory, the deep ancestral memory encoded in myth and legend and creation stories. Every ancient culture had the same basic narrative. A golden age, a paradise, a time when the world was different, when trees grew to impossible heights, when the sky was closer, when giants walked the earth, then catastrophe, flood, fire, divine punishment, the world remade, the paradise lost. What if those weren't metaphors? What if Earth had been covered in megatrees, organisms so massive they created their own ecosystems, their own atmospheric effects, their own gravitational influences, trees whose trunks were miles wide, whose canopies touched the edge of space, whose roots penetrated to the mantle, connected underground in vast networks, sharing nutrients and information and consciousness. Not individual organisms, but a single planetary entity, a world forest. And what if something had cut them down? War, cataclysm, deliberate, extermination, leaving only stumps, Devil's Tower in Wyoming, Shiprock in New Mexico, the Giant's Causeway in Ireland, the Organ Pipes in Namibia, dozens of formations worldwide, all showing the same hexagonal columnar structure, all dismissed as volcanic activity despite the suspicious similarities. What if they were stumps? What if the roots were still alive, still connected, still waiting? Michael found forums, message boards, communities of people who believed this theory. Most were dismissed as cranks, conspiracy theorists, flat earthers, but some posted evidence, photographs of hexagonal patterns in stone that matched wood grain too perfectly, chemical analyses showing organic compounds in supposedly inorganic formations, reports of vibrations detected near these sites during specific astronomical alignments. One poster claimed to have worked for a geological survey company contracted by the government, said they'd been ordered to falsify data, to report volcanic origin even when samples suggested otherwise, said there were military installations hidden near every major petrified stump formation, said those installations monitored seismic activity that didn't match any known geological process, said the activity was getting stronger. The post was deleted within hours, the user account banned. But Michael had screenshot it, backed it up to multiple cloud services, saved it to encrypted drives. He was learning to think like someone being hunted, because he probably was. Chapter 18. Return to the tower. 3 months after the ritual, Michael went back. Not officially, not during visiting hours. He took vacation time from work, told nobody where he was going, and drove to Devil's Tower on a Tuesday night in January. Freezing, moonless, empty. He parked at the same ridge 3 miles out, same vantage point, sat in the truck with the engine off, heat slowly dissipating, breath fogging the windows. No ritual tonight, no robed figures, no chanting, just the tower silhouetted against stars, silent and still. Michael checked his watch. 11 p.m. He waited. 11:30. Nothing. Midnight. Still nothing. At 12:17 a.m. he got out of the truck. The cold hit him like a physical force. 20 degrees below zero. Wind chill making it feel even worse. He walked toward the tower. Not all the way. Not to the base. Just close enough. Close enough to touch the soil. He knelt in the frozen grass, pulled off one glove, and pressed his bare hand to the ground. Waited. Listened. Felt. For a long time, there was nothing. Just cold earth. Frozen solid. Dead until spring. Then, a vibration. Faint. Barely perceptible. Like the idle of a distant engine or the whisper of underground water. Michael closed his eyes. Concentrated. The vibration intensified. Not random, not geological. Rhythmic. Pulsing. Like a heartbeat. Slow. Patient. Ancient. He opened his eyes and looked at Devil's Tower. In the starlight it looked the same as always. Just stone. But he could feel it now. Feel the life beneath. The roots spreading through miles of bedrock, connecting to other roots, other stumps, other remnants of whatever had once covered Earth. A network, planetary in scale, still alive, still aware, still waiting. Michael heard something then, not with his ears, in his mind. A whisper, not words, not language, just recognition. The tower knew he was there, knew he had witnessed, knew he understood, and it was content to wait. Because time meant nothing to something that had existed for epochs. A few more years, a few more decades, a few more centuries. Eventually the world would change, the ice would melt, the soil would warm, the conditions would align, and the roots would grow again, fed by ritual, by worship, by the carefully cultivated devotion of those who knew the truth and kept it secret, the powerful, the elite, the guardians of hidden knowledge. They would tend the stumps like gardeners tending saplings, nurturing them, feeding them, waiting for the day when the world trees would rise again. Michael stood up, his hand numb from cold and contact, looked at Devil's Tower one last time. It stood silent, patient, eternal. And deep beneath his feet, in the frozen darkness of ancient root networks, something pulsed. Slow, steady, alive. Epilogue. The patient growth. Michael Carver still works night shifts maintaining roads around Devil's Tower National Monument. He files his reports in triplicate, clears rockfall, checks drainage systems, lives a quiet life in a one-bedroom house with a dog named Rusty and a television that gets 4 channels on a good day. He never talks about what he saw, never posts about it online, never tries to convince anyone of the truth. He learned early that truth doesn't spread through argument or evidence. It spreads through patience, through waiting, through the slow accumulation of people who witness things they cannot explain and choose to remember rather than forget. He's not alone. There are others. Park rangers who've heard the chanting, maintenance workers who've felt the vibrations, tourists who visited at the wrong time and seen things that shouldn't exist. They recognise each other. Small signs, subtle acknowledgements, a certain way of looking at the tower, a hesitation before entering the monument grounds after dark, a refusal to accept the official geological explanation. The network grows, slowly, carefully, just like the roots beneath their feet. Michael doesn't know what will happen when the trees finally grow again. Maybe it will be apocalyptic, the end of human civilization, crushed beneath organisms too vast to comprehend. Maybe it will be transcendent, a return to paradise, to the golden age remembered in myth. Maybe it will be something else entirely, but he knows it's coming. He can feel it in the ground. In the increasing frequency of rituals, more gatherings, more chanting, more offerings fed into stone fissures around the world, in the way weather patterns are shifting, growing stranger, as if the atmosphere itself is remembering how things used to be, in the dreams people are having, shared dreams of massive trees, of climbing through canopies that touch the stars, of roots spreading through darkness, connecting everything, making all life part of a single vast organism. The world is changing, has been changing, will continue to change, and Devil's Tower stands patient, waiting, because if it truly is a stump, then something once stood there so large it touched the heavens, and if roots remain beneath us, if networks still connect the scattered stumps across continents, if the organisms are merely dormant rather than dead, then whatever was cut down might not be gone forever, just sleeping, just waiting, just growing, slow and patient and inevitable, the way trees always do.